about dynamic PLSQL, you'll see that in some cases, the number of placeholders do not have to match the number of bind variables. Oracle works things differently when you have the same placeholder referenced more than once. So that's dynamic PLSQL. Finally, let's take a look at what's involved in trying to bind to a non-SQL data type. In Oracle 9.2 and higher, you can use the set row syntax to update an entire row at a time with a Plsql record. So I want to do that dynamically. I'm going to pass in a record, the department ID, and the value. And I'm going to try to update the entire row to that record. So colon, row data, there's my placeholder. And in my using clause, I have my record. And we actually don't need that second value. Let's see what happens when I try to compile this. It tells me expressions have to be of SQL types. That's a very clear statement. I love those kinds of errors. We know exactly what the problem is. Oracle has no way to know what a record structure is. It'd be nice if it did. It really should. But it doesn't work that way. Plsql is a superset of SQL. It knows about SQL and it can work with SQL types. SQL doesn't know anything about Plsql. So you can't bind records, you can't bind associative array types, you can't bind booleans, and so on. So lots of different examples. Play around with those yourself. Make sure you understand all these different nuances. Let's move on. Method 2 and the returning clause. So you can use the returning clause with DML, both static and dynamic, to retrieve information about the effect of the DML statement just executed. Essentially, for example, when I insert into a table, I might call the sequence.nextVal right inside my insert statement to generate the next primary key. And then I need that primary key back in my Plsql code. Rather than having to do a separate select statement to get it after the insert is finished, I can request the employee ID of the primary key value right inside the insert statement, and therefore I avoid an extra context switch, and that will improve the performance of my code. Well, you can use the returning clause with your DML statement dynamically, and if you do so, then you also need to add a returning clause to your execute immediate statement. And if the DML statement that you're executing dynamically changes more than one row, you're going to have to do a bulk collect to retrieve all the different values in your returning clause. Let's check it out. Again, I'll make a copy of my employees table. And let's take a look at set one row. I pass in the column name, I pass in the employee ID, and I want to give that employee a salary of $10,000 or a commission of $10,000, whatever the column name is. So I set that column equal to 1,000, 10,000. For that employee ID, there's my binding of my placeholder. Now I want to find out the last name of the person who got the raise, so I say returning last name into, and then another placeholder. Now this placeholder does not appear in the using clause. Instead, notice my execute immediate, my update string. Using, I have a single in bind variable in my using clause. I have a separate returning into clause for execute immediate that specifies the variable containing the name. Compile this code. It compiles no problem. And by the way, if I try to use this in my using clause, so that's going in, this is going out, it'll compile, but it won't run. Let's try that first. So in my first approach, I've said, well, this is pretty clear. This one's coming in, this one's going out, so just specify it as an outbind variable. But when I try to run this, I see, what do I see? Wait a minute, did it work? Can I do that? I wouldn't have thought so. Let's run that once more. It's telling me that it did find and update styles. Is this really? Maybe you can do it this way as well. So I compile this procedure, set one row. Okay, well, it looks like you can use it in the out clause as well. Interesting. I had thought that you had to say returning, so it looks like you can do it both ways. Fascinating. Let's go back to the original formulation because I think that also makes the most sense. So we take this procedure. Now we match up the returning with returning into. Let's compile that. And now let's run this version. And again, we see that styles is updated. Well, that's interesting. Again, I wasn't aware of that. You can actually do it both ways. I suggest you use the returning clause because that more clearly aligns with the returning into clause of execute immediate, because that more clearly aligns with the returning clause in the DML statement. So that's with a single row change. Let's see what happens if multiple rows are being changed. Now I'm going to pass in the column and the department ID, give everybody in that department the $10,000 salary or commission. Now let's try it first with returning into. So I'm going to compile my program. And yes, I'm going to say returning into that name. I run my code, and I get exact fetch returns more than the requested number of rows. When I say returning into, that's saying just get me a single value back. Obviously, it's a single name. But returning might return multiple rows of data. In fact, in this case, the department ID, department 50, has lots of rows in it. So it tried to fit multiple values into this single value. Doesn't work. So the bottom line is that when you're using the returning clause, and the returning and the DML statement may or will update more than one row of data, then you have to say returning bulk collect into. Now bulk collect is part of the bulk processing feature set of Plsql, and that's explained in a separate set of lessons on turbocharging SQL performance in Plsql. So if bulk collect is new to you, check it out, learn all about it. It's a fantastic feature. And if I take this approach, and run my code, notice the name updated. Well, the name updated, actually, let me fix this a little bit. Number of names updated. So I'm going to do execute immediate, bind in my department ID, returning bulk collect into a collection of strings, a list of strings, the type of which is defined in DBMS SQL. And then I'm going to say show me the number of names that were updated. So let's just do that one more time. My apologies for not explaining it better first. Number of names updated, 45. So there are 45 employees in Department 50. So when you're retrieving more than one row in the returning clause, or when you're changing more than one row in your DML statement, the returning clause will return more than one value. You simply say, you don't say bulk collect into in the DML statement, but when I'm getting the information back out, then you need the bulk collect. And last, you can also use method 2 dynamic SQL with a FORALL statement. Again, FORALL is part of the bulk processing feature set. It will greatly improve the performance of repetitive executions of the same DML statement. And you can definitely use it with your execute immediate. So you simply include execute immediate under the FORALL header. The using clause now references the bind array. In other words, you have to bind an array or collection into the DML statement, and now that's in the using clause using the FORALL iterator. So FORALL, here's the iterator, just like a for loop. Here's my DML statement, my dynamic DML statement. Here's the execute immediate. And in my using clause, I need to make sure that I have a value for every placeholder, just like you saw with the other non-FORALL dynamic SQL. But in this case, notice I'm going to use the binding array and reference the iterator inside my using clause. So that says use this element of the collection, bind it into that iteration of the update statement. And then, since I have the returning clause, I need a returning bulk collect into, and then my list of names that are being modified. Let's take a look at the example. So I declare a nested table of numbers, a nested table of strings. And by the way, if you're not familiar with collections and what a nested table is, you should watch my series of lessons on collections. Update employees. Pass in the column name, pass in the list of employees that need to get the update, need to get a 10% raise. So update the employees table, set column equal to column times 1.1 for the specified employee ID, and get the last name of the employee who was modified and put it into my second placeholder. The using clause says use this element of the array, matching up the iterator name, returning bulk collect into my list of names, and then show me all the names of the people who got the raise. So I'm going to iterate through my list of names and display the values. Now before I run this, let's first try it with a problem. In other words, not doing it correctly. So let's take this procedure. And first of all, I want to show you that you have to reference this index. So for example, if I put 1 here, notice it tells me DML statement without bulk in bind cannot be used inside FORALL. I didn't bind in the value. The iterator is not referenced anywhere in my statement. It's not valid. I have to provide the indexing. So that link up has to be in the statement. Oracle will catch it at compile time. If I leave off my returning, if I got a returning here and no returning in my using clause, Oracle will not catch that at compile time. It compiled. It'll catch it when I try to run it. So now if I try to run this statement, run this procedure, it tells me not all variables are bound because I can bind this element, this variable, into :1, but there's nothing for :2. So let's go back to the original version that should work correctly. Clear out our output from the last run. So now I'm going to execute my DML statement dynamically inside FORALL. I've got my iterator being referenced in my using clause, and I've got returning bulk collect to retrieve my names. I run my code, no errors, and I see the names of the 2 employees for 138 and 147. For 138 and 147, they both got their 10% raise. Draw some conclusions. Dynamic SQL Method 2 introduces the need for the using clause. That's what Method 2 means. You have a fixed number of bind variables known at the time of compilation. So I have a using clause to basically match up my actual values with my placeholders, and you need to make sure that the number of placeholders always matches the number of bind variables. Even if the placeholder name is used multiple times, you need a distinct set of bind variables in your using list. You can only bind in SQL compatible expressions, so Booleans, records, associative arrays cannot be used with dynamic SQL, even with dynamic Plsql. And you can execute Method 2 dynamic SQL as part of a FORALL statement. Next steps. Download the demo zip, unzip it, go back through this lesson, check out each one of the different files that I've created for you, run the examples, make sure you understand why they work and in some cases why they don't work. Play around with the different formats. You'll learn things that you may not have known before. For example, I learned in the process of giving this lesson that you don't have to use the returning clause in execute immediate to get that value back out. That was interesting. I don't recommend it, and it's probably not documented. You should use the returning clause, but it's always interesting to find out about new things that Plsql can do. And then learn how to execute dynamic queries, Method 3 dynamic SQL, and explore the many advanced topics in dynamic SQL, such as Method 4 dynamic SQL, working with very large strings, and 11G features. Thanks for joining me. I hope this helped, and happy Plsql coding.